The morning started like any other Tuesday at Buckingham Palace. The staff moved quietly through the grand corridors, preparing for another day of royal duties. Queen Camilla sat in her private study, reviewing the day's schedule with her personal secretary. Outside, the grey London sky threatened rain, and tourists gathered near the palace gates, hoping for a glimpse of the royal family. Inside the palace walls, however, something unexpected was about to shake the very foundation of the monarchy. A sealed envelope had arrived earlier that morning, marked confidential and addressed directly to Queen Camilla. The envelope bore the logo of a prestigious genetic testing laboratory in Switzerland, one known for serving high-profile clients who valued discretion above all else. Margaret, the Queen's most trusted aide for over 15 years, had placed the envelope on the mahogany desk without a word. She knew better than to ask questions about such matters. Camilla's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the letter opener, a gift from King Charles years ago. The silver blade sliced through the paper with ease, but nothing could have prepared her for what lay inside. The DNA report was extensive, filled with scientific terminology and complex charts. But the conclusion was written in plain English, impossible to misunderstand. Camilla read the words once, then twice, her face draining of color. Her teacup clattered against the saucer as she set it down with shaking hands. The report revealed something that had been hidden for decades, a secret so profound that it threatened to rewrite royal history. According to the genetic analysis, there were unexpected markers in Camilla's DNA that didn't align with the family lineage she had always known. The implications were staggering. Questions about her ancestry, questions that nobody had thought to ask before, now demanded answers. For several minutes, Camilla sat motionless, staring at the papers spread before her. Her mind raced through memories of her childhood, her parents, the stories she'd been told about her family's history. Everything she thought she knew suddenly seemed uncertain. The walls of her elegant study felt like they were closing in, suffocating her with the weight of this revelation. Margaret knocked softly and entered with more correspondence, but she immediately sensed something was wrong. The Queen's usual composed demeanor had cracked. Her eyes were red, and she clutched the papers as if they might disappear if she let go. Margaret had served the royal family long enough to know when to speak and when to simply be present. She quietly placed the new letters on a side table and withdrew, closing the door with barely a sound. Camilla knew she had to tell someone, but who? This wasn't the kind of news that could be shared casually over lunch. The implications extended far beyond her personal identity. The monarchy itself could be affected. The press would have a field day if this information leaked. She could already imagine the headlines, the speculation, the endless analysis by so-called royal experts. She thought of Charles, her husband, and the king. He deserved to know immediately. Their marriage had weathered so many storms already, from the public's initial rejection of their relationship to the constant comparisons with Diana. They had finally reached a place of acceptance and respect. Would this new revelation undo all of that progress? The report also raised questions about her children and grandchildren. If her own lineage was different than believed, what did that mean for them? The royal family tree, so carefully documented and displayed for public consumption, might need revision. Genealogists and historians would have to reassess decades of accepted fact. Camilla picked up her private phone, the one with no assistants or operators listening in. Her finger hovered over Charles's number, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. Not yet. This conversation needed to happen face-to-face in private, where they could speak freely without fear of being overheard. She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the palace gardens. Tourists continued their daily pilgrimage, taking photos and buying souvenirs. They saw the monarchy as something permanent and unchanging, a connection to Britain's glorious past. They had no idea that inside these walls everything was about to change. The DNA test hadn't been her idea originally. It started 6 months ago when a distant relative, someone Camilla barely knew, had reached out through intermediaries. This relative had done their own genetic testing and discovered some anomalies in the family tree. They suggested that Camilla might want to do the same, just to clear up any questions. At first, Camilla had dismissed it. Why would she need a DNA test? She knew who she was, knew her family history, but the relative had been persistent and eventually curiosity got the better of her. What harm could it do? She had submitted a sample discreetly through a trusted doctor, using a pseudonym for additional privacy. Now she regretted that decision deeply. Ignorance, she realized, had been bliss. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The truth, whatever it fully entailed, was now out there, documented in scientific reports and stored in laboratory databases. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was her private secretary, reminding her that she had a charity luncheon in 2 hours. Camilla glanced at the clock, shocked to see how much time had passed. She had been sitting with this devastating news for nearly an hour, frozen in disbelief. She needed to compose herself, to maintain the royal facade for just a few more hours. The luncheon couldn't be canceled without raising questions. She would attend, smile for the cameras, make polite conversation, all while this secret burned in her chest like a fire. But first, she needed to secure these documents. She couldn't risk anyone else seeing them before she had a chance to tell Charles and decide on a course of action. She locked the papers in her personal safe, a small act that felt both protective and futile. The truth was out there now, recorded and real, no matter where she hid the physical evidence. As she freshened her makeup in the mirror, preparing to face the world, Camilla made a decision. She would tell Charles tonight after dinner, when they could be alone in their private quarters. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The monarchy had survived scandals before, from abdications to divorces. It would survive this too. But as she left her study and walked toward her waiting car, Camilla couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. The charity luncheon felt like it lasted forever. Camilla smiled and nodded at all the right moments, posed for photographs with the organizers, and delivered her prepared remarks about the importance of literacy programs for underprivileged children. Nobody in the room could have guessed that behind her polished exterior, her mind was racing with panic and confusion. During the dessert course, Lady Pemberton, a longtime friend and fellow patron of the charity, leaned over and whispered that Camilla looked tired. She suggested perhaps the Queen was working too hard and needed a proper holiday. Camilla laughed it off, blaming the demanding schedule, but inside she wondered if her distress was really that visible. She would need to do better at hiding her emotions, especially in the days ahead. The drive back to the palace felt shorter than usual. Too soon, she was walking through the familiar corridors, greeting staff members who had no idea their world was about to shift. Charles was in meetings all afternoon, giving her a few more hours to gather her thoughts. She retreated to their private sitting room, a comfortable space where they spent their quiet evenings together. Camilla poured herself a glass of water with trembling hands and sat down to review the DNA report once more. She needed to understand every detail before speaking with Charles. The scientific language was dense, but the key findings were clear enough. There were genetic markers that suggested her maternal lineage was not what the family records indicated. Somewhere in her ancestry, there had been a break from the documented family tree. The most shocking revelation was about her grandmother, Lady Rosemary, who had always been presented as the daughter of a respected aristocratic family. According to the DNA evidence, there was no genetic connection to that family line at all. This meant that Lady Rosemary had either been adopted, or her parentage had been deliberately concealed. In the strict social hierarchy of early 20th century Britain, such secrets were not uncommon among the upper classes. Camilla thought back to the few memories she had of her grandmother, who had passed away when Camilla was just 12 years old. Lady Rosemary had been elegant and reserved, always proper in her conduct. She rarely spoke about her own childhood or parents, which the family had attributed to her generation's general reluctance to dwell on the past. Now that silence took on new meaning. If Lady Rosemary's parentage had been hidden, who was her real father? The DNA report couldn't answer that question definitively, but it did suggest possible geographic and ethnic origins that didn't match the family's documented British aristocratic roots. There were markers suggesting Eastern European ancestry, which opened up dozens of possible scenarios. Camilla's mind spun with possibilities. Had Lady Rosemary been the product of an affair, an illegitimate child given a false identity to protect someone's reputation? Or perhaps there was a more innocent explanation, an adoption that was kept private for reasons lost to time. Without access to historical records and more family DNA samples for comparison, the full truth might never be known. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, creating patterns on the Persian carpet. Camilla found herself studying the carpet's intricate design, thinking about how families were like that, patterns woven together over generations, each thread connected to the ones around it. But what happened when you discovered that some of those threads weren't what they appeared to be? Did the whole tapestry unravel? She heard footsteps in the corridor and recognized Charles's distinctive walk. Her heart began to pound. This was it, the moment she had been dreading all day. She quickly hid the DNA report in a drawer just as he entered the room, his face brightening when he saw her. Charles immediately sensed something was wrong. After so many years together, he could read her moods with ease. He crossed the room and took her hands in his expression shifting from pleasant to concerned. He asked what was troubling her, and she found she couldn't speak. The words stuck in her throat, heavy and impossible. She pulled away gently and retrieved the report from the drawer. With shaking hands, she gave it to him, watching his face as he began to read. His expression went from confusion to shock to something she couldn't quite identify. Disbelief, perhaps, or was it fear? He sat down heavily in his favorite chair, still reading, his jaw clenched. The silence between them stretched out, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Finally, Charles looked up at her and she saw tears in his eyes. Not tears of anger or disappointment, but tears of empathy. He understood immediately what this meant for her. The identity crisis it created, the uncertainty about her own place in the world. He asked her when she had received the report, and she explained about the morning's delivery. She told him about the distant relative who had prompted the test, about her own curiosity and the decision to find out the truth. Now she wished she could take it all back, return to the blissful ignorance of yesterday. Charles stood and pulled her into an embrace. He told her that this changed nothing between them, that she was still the woman he loved, still the queen consort, still the mother and grandmother who held their family together. But even as he spoke those comforting words, they both knew the implications extended far beyond their personal relationship. The constitutional questions alone were staggering. While Camilla's position as queen consort didn't depend on her bloodline in the same way Charles's position as king did, the revelation would still create a media frenzy. The tabloids would dissect every aspect of her ancestry, legitimate or not. Royal commentators would debate what it meant for the monarchy's image and credibility. There were also the personal implications for their children and grandchildren. Tom and Laura, Camilla's children from her first marriage, would want to know about their ancestry. Her grandchildren deserved to understand their heritage. And then there were Charles's sons, William and Harry, and their families. This would affect them all, even if indirectly. Charles suggested they needed to bring in trusted advisors immediately. The palace needed a strategy for if and when this information became public. They needed historians to research Lady Rosemary's background, lawyers to understand the legal implications, and PR experts to manage the inevitable media storm. But most importantly, they needed to control the narrative before someone else did. Camilla felt a wave of relief that Charles was taking charge, thinking strategically when she could barely think at all. But she also felt a deep sadness. This wasn't how she had imagined their reign would unfold. They had worked so hard to earn public acceptance, to prove they could serve the nation with dignity and dedication. Now all of that could be overshadowed by questions about her identity. As evening fell over London, they sat together in the gathering darkness, neither bothering to turn on the lights. Outside, the city continued its evening rhythm, completely unaware that inside the palace walls, a secret had been uncovered that would soon change everything. The next morning brought no comfort. Camilla had barely slept, tossing and turning while her mind replayed every conversation with her late mother, searching for clues she might have missed. When she finally gave up on sleep around 5 in the morning, she found Charles already awake in his study, surrounded by papers and making notes in his precise handwriting. He had been researching what little information existed about Lady Rosemary's early life. The official record showed her birth in 1910, listed parents from a well-known aristocratic family, and a conventional upbringing befitting her social class. But Charles had noticed something odd. There were almost no photographs of Lady Rosemary as a young child, which was unusual for a family of that prominence. Most of the earliest photos showed her from age 7 or 8 onwards. Camilla joined him. wrapping her silk robe tighter against the morning chill. Together they studied the documents, looking for answers that seemed just out of reach. Charles had also pulled out Camilla's own family tree, the one that hung framed in their private quarters, showing generations of distinguished ancestors. Now that beautiful document felt like a lie. By 8 o'clock they had made a difficult decision. They would need to tell certain key people before taking any further action. Sir Malcolm Hartley, the king's private secretary, would need to know immediately. So would the palace's head of communications, Rebecca Chen, who had guided them through several crises before. And they would need to consult with Lord Ashworth, the royal family's longtime legal advisor. The meetings began at 9 o'clock sharp. Sir Malcolm arrived first, his usual cheerful demeanor fading quickly when he saw their grave faces. Charles handed him the DNA report without preamble. They watched as the distinguished secretary, who had seen nearly everything in his 30 years of royal service, turned pale. He lowered himself into a chair and read the entire document twice before speaking. His first question was practical. Who else knew about this? Camilla explained about the Swiss laboratory, emphasizing their reputation for absolute discretion. The relative who had suggested the test had been told nothing yet. As far as they knew, only the 3 people in this room, plus the lab technicians, had any knowledge of the findings. Rebecca Chen arrived next, her tablet already in hand, ready to manage whatever crisis had prompted the emergency meeting. When she learned the nature of the situation, even her considerable composure cracked. She set down her tablet and asked them to walk her through everything from the beginning. As they talked, she took notes, her mind already working through scenarios and response strategies. Lord Ashworth, when he arrived and was briefed, provided the legal perspective they needed. From a constitutional standpoint, he explained, Camilla's ancestry didn't affect her position as queen consort. That title came from her marriage to the king, not from her bloodline. However, the public perception angle was another matter entirely. The monarchy's strength came partly from its image as the embodiment of British heritage and tradition. Questions about the queen consort's ancestry could be weaponized by Republican movements and critics of the monarchy. The discussion continued for hours, with Rebecca occasionally stepping out to take phone calls and make arrangements. She suggested they needed to commission a thorough historical investigation before any public announcement. They needed to know the full story, not just the DNA evidence. Who was Lady Rosemary's real father? What were the circumstances of her birth and adoption, if that's what it was? Without these answers, they would be unable to control the narrative. Charles agreed, and Lord Ashworth offered to engage a discreet team of genealogists and historians who specialized in aristocratic lineages. These experts could access archives and records that ordinary researchers couldn't. With luck, they might piece together the truth within a few weeks, but as they talked about strategies and investigations, Camilla felt increasingly detached from the conversation. They were discussing her life, her identity, as if it were a problem to be solved, a PR crisis to be managed. She understood the necessity of their approach, but it didn't make her feel any less lost. During a break in the meeting, she excused herself and walked to the palace's private chapel, a small peaceful space where she sometimes went for quiet reflection. She wasn't particularly religious, but the chapel's serenity always helped her think more clearly. Now sitting in the wooden pew, she finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came in great shuddering sobs that she had been holding back since yesterday morning. She cried for her grandmother, whose secrets had died with her. She cried for her mother, who had passed away without knowing the truth about her own ancestry. She cried for herself, for the comfortable certainty of identity that had been stripped away. And she cried for what this might do to the family she had worked so hard to become part of. She didn't hear the door open or the soft footsteps approaching. When a gentle hand touched her shoulder, she looked up to find Charles standing beside her. He had left the meeting to find her, somehow knowing she needed him. He sat down beside her and held her hand, saying nothing, just being present in her grief. Through her tears, Camilla finally spoke the fear that had been haunting her since she first read the report. She told Charles that she felt like a fraud. For decades, she had presented herself as one thing, certain of her place in Britain's aristocratic heritage. Now she didn't know who she really was. How could she represent British tradition and history when her own connection to that history was uncertain? Charles squeezed her hand tighter and spoke firmly. He told her that identity was more than bloodlines and family trees. She had earned her place through her character, her dedication, and her service. The British people had come to accept and even admire her not because of her ancestry, but because of who she was as a person. This revelation might create challenges, but it didn't diminish everything she had accomplished. His words helped, but Camilla still felt adrift. She had always defined herself partly through her family connections, the long line of respectable ancestors who had shaped British society for generations. Now that foundation felt shaky. Who was she if not the person she had always believed herself to be? They sat in the chapel for nearly an hour, talking through her fears and his reassurances. Eventually they returned to the meeting, where Sir Malcolm, Rebecca, and Lord Ashworth had been planning the next steps. The genealogists would begin their investigation immediately. In the meantime, the palace would proceed with normal operations, giving no hint that anything was amiss. But that afternoon brought an unexpected complication. Tom, Camilla's son, called wanting to visit with his children. It was a routine request, the kind that usually brought Camilla joy. But how could she see her grandchildren while carrying this secret? How could she look Tom in the eye and not tell him that his entire understanding of his family history had just been turned upside down? Charles suggested they tell Tom and Laura soon, before the investigation was complete. They deserved to know, and keeping it from them would only make things worse. Camilla reluctantly agreed, knowing he was right but dreading the conversation. She would have to watch her children process the same shock and confusion she was still struggling with. As the day ended, Camilla found herself back in her study, staring at old family photographs. There was her mother as a young woman, bearing a striking resemblance to Lady Rosemary. There was Lady Rosemary herself, elegant and mysterious, her eyes holding secrets that could never be revealed. And there was Camilla as a child, blissfully ignorant of the complicated truth that lay hidden in her DNA. 3 days after the revelation, the genealogists made their first significant discovery. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a respected historian specializing in early 20th century British society, had been given access to private archives that few researchers ever saw. What she found in a dusty collection of letters at a manor house in Gloucestershire changed everything. The letters, written between 1909 and 1911, told a story that had been deliberately hidden for over a century. They were correspondence between Lady Margaret Ashford, the woman listed as Lady Rosemary's mother, and her younger sister Beatrice. The sisters had been remarkably candid with each other, and their letters revealed a scandal that would have ruined the family if it had become public. Dr. Warren presented her findings to Camilla, Charles, and the advisory team in the palace's private library. She had brought photocopies of the most relevant letters, handling them carefully as if they were precious artifacts. In a way they were. They held the truth that Camilla had been seeking. According to the letters, Lady Margaret's husband, Lord Edmund Ashford, had been unable to father children due to an illness in his youth. This was a source of tremendous shame and sadness for the couple, who desperately wanted an heir to continue the family name. In 1909, Lady Margaret made a shocking decision. She traveled to Vienna, Austria, where she had a distant cousin who ran a private establishment that helped aristocratic women in difficult situations. Through this cousin's connections, Lady Margaret was introduced to a young Polish musician named Antoni Kowalski. He was talented, educated, and most importantly, discreet. An arrangement was made. Antoni would father a child with Lady Margaret, a transaction that would solve her problem and provide him with enough money to pursue his musical career in Paris. The letters revealed Lady Margaret's conflicted feelings about the arrangement. She wrote to Beatrice about her guilt over deceiving her husband, but also about her desperate desire to give him the child he wanted. Edmund was never told the truth. When Lady Margaret became pregnant and returned to England, it was presented as a miracle, a blessing that had finally come to the couple after years of hoping. Lady Rosemary was born in March 1910. The secret of her true parentage was known only to Lady Margaret, Beatrice, and presumably the cousin in Vienna who had facilitated the arrangement. Lord Edmund raised Rosemary as his own, never suspecting the truth. When he died in 1935, he went to his grave believing she was his biological daughter. Dr. Warren had also uncovered information about Antoni Kowalski. He had indeed gone to Paris after the arrangement with Lady Margaret, where he enjoyed moderate success as a pianist and composer. He married a French woman in 1912 and had 3 children. He died in 1954, having never returned to England and apparently never having told anyone about his role in Lady Rosemary's conception. The DNA evidence now made perfect sense. Camilla's unexpected genetic markers were Eastern European because her great-grandfather had been Polish. Lady Rosemary's true heritage had been hidden beneath layers of aristocratic respectability and carefully maintained fiction. The family tree that Camilla had always relied upon was partly real and partly constructed. Camilla listened to Dr. Warren's presentation in stunned silence. This wasn't the scandal she had imagined. There was no affair, no betrayal in the conventional sense. Instead, there was a woman desperate to fulfill her role as a wife and mother, making an unconventional choice that solved her problem while maintaining her social standing. In the restrictive world of Edwardian high society, Lady Margaret had been remarkably resourceful and brave. But Camilla also felt a deep sadness for her grandmother. Lady Rosemary had lived her entire life not knowing the truth about her own father. She had grown up believing Lord Edmund's blood ran in her veins, had inherited what she thought was his family legacy, had passed on stories about her father to her own children. All of it based on a loving deception. Dr. Warren had more information to share. She had found Antoni Kowalski's descendants living in France. They knew nothing about their grandfather's connection to British aristocracy. The genealogist suggested that with their permission, DNA comparisons could be done to confirm the connection definitively. It would remove any lingering doubt about the findings. Charles asked the obvious question. Should they reach out to these relatives? Did they have the right to disrupt their lives with information about their grandfather's secret arrangement over a century ago? And what would be the implications if they refused testing or worse, decided to go public with the information? Lord Ashworth advised extreme caution. Contact with the French family could be made through intermediaries, with all parties signing strict confidentiality agreements. But there was always a risk. The more people who knew the truth, the greater the chance of a leak. They needed to weigh the value of absolute genetic confirmation against the security risk. Rebecca Chen, ever practical, pointed out that they didn't actually need the French family's cooperation. The historical evidence was compelling enough. The letters, combined with the DNA evidence they already had, told a complete story. Reaching out to Antoni's descendants would only complicate matters and increase the risk of exposure. Camilla found herself thinking about those descendants, ordinary people living their lives in France, completely unaware that their grandfather had helped create a branch of the British aristocracy. They were her distant cousins, connected to her by blood, if not by anything else. Did she have an obligation to tell them? Or would silence be kinder? Over the following days, more details emerged from the archives. Dr. Warren discovered that Beatrice, Lady Margaret's sister, had kept a private diary. In it, she recorded her thoughts about the arrangement and her sister's choice. Beatrice had been supportive, even admiring of Margaret's determination to secure her marriage and social position. But the diary also revealed Beatrice's concerns about the secret. She worried about what would happen if the truth ever came out, especially to Rosemary herself. Those fears had been justified. Now, 3 generations later, the truth had indeed emerged, and it was causing exactly the kind of upheaval Beatrice had dreaded. The irony wasn't lost on Camilla. Her great-great-aunt had worried about this very moment over 100 years ago. The investigation also uncovered something unexpected. Lady Margaret had left a sealed letter with her lawyer, to be opened only in the event that questions ever arose about Rosemary's parentage. The law firm still existed, though under different management, and the letter had been sitting in their vault for 90 years, forgotten. When Dr. Warren tracked it down and had it retrieved, it provided Lady Margaret's own explanation of her actions, written in her own hand. The letter was beautifully written, showing Lady Margaret to be an articulate and thoughtful woman. She explained her reasoning, expressed her eternal gratitude to Antoni Kowalski, and begged forgiveness from any future family members who might judge her harshly. She also wrote that she had no regrets. Rosemary had been the light of her life, and Edmund had been a wonderful father to her. The deception, she argued, had harmed no one and had brought happiness to many. Reading her great-great-grandmother's words, Camilla felt a strange connection across time. Lady Margaret had been protecting her family, just as Camilla now felt compelled to protect hers. They were both women navigating the complex expectations of their positions, making difficult choices for the people they loved. But Lady Margaret's letter also contained a warning. She wrote that she hoped the truth would never be needed, but if it was, she trusted that her descendants would handle it with wisdom and discretion. The family's reputation, she noted, was not built on bloodlines alone but on character and conduct. Whoever discovered the truth, she hoped they would remember that. Those words gave Camilla something to hold on to. Her identity crisis wasn't as simple as discovering she wasn't who she thought she was. She was still herself, still the person who had lived 60-plus years of experiences, made choices, built relationships, and developed her character. The DNA didn't change any of that. It just added a new chapter to her family's complex history. The conversation with Tom and Laura couldn't be delayed any longer. Camilla invited them both to the palace on a Saturday afternoon, telling them she had something important to discuss. Tom arrived first, his children with their nanny so that he could have private time with his mother. Laura came shortly after, sensing from Camilla's tone that this wasn't a casual family gathering. They met in the same sitting room where Camilla had first told Charles about the DNA report. The afternoon light streaming through the windows felt too cheerful for what she was about to do. Tom and Laura sat together on the sofa, exchanging concerned glances. They both knew their mother well enough to recognize when something serious was weighing on her mind. Camilla began by telling them about the DNA test, explaining how it had started with the distant relative's suggestion. She watched their expressions shift from curiosity to confusion as she described the unexpected results. Then she shared everything Dr. Warren had discovered. The letters from Lady Margaret, the truth about Antoni Kowalski, the careful deception that had shaped their family for generations. Tom was the first to speak. His immediate reaction was practical, asking questions about the evidence and how certain they could be. As a businessman used to dealing with facts and data, he wanted to understand the full scope of what they knew. Laura, more emotional by nature, simply looked shocked, tears welling in her eyes as she processed what this meant for her understanding of her own identity. Camilla gave them copies of the key letters and the DNA report. She wanted them to see for themselves, to have the evidence in their own hands. As they read, she watched their faces, seeing her own shock and confusion reflected back at her. This was exactly what she had dreaded, watching her children struggle with the same identity crisis that had overwhelmed her. Laura asked if this changed anything about who they were as a family. Camilla assured her that it didn't, that they were still the same people they had always been, just with a more complicated and interesting family history. But even as she said it, she could see Laura wasn't entirely convinced. For someone who had always taken pride in her aristocratic heritage, this revelation shook the foundation of her self-understanding. Tom wanted to know why Lady Rosemary herself had never been told. Camilla explained that Lady Margaret had chosen to protect her daughter from a truth that could have destroyed her social position and marriage prospects. In that era, illegitimacy was a devastating stigma, even if the circumstances were as unique as theirs. Lady Margaret had taken the secret to her grave, probably believing it was the kindest thing she could do. The conversation continued for hours. They talked about Antoni Kowalski, wondering what kind of man he had been beyond the bare facts Dr. Warren had uncovered. They discussed whether to attempt contact with his French descendants or to leave them in peace. Tom suggested they might have a right to know about their connection to British aristocracy, while Laura worried about opening a door that could never be closed again. Eventually, the question turned to the future. What would happen when this became public? Tom, ever the pragmatist, assumed that it would leak eventually. Secrets this significant rarely stayed hidden forever, especially in the age of DNA testing and genealogy websites. He suggested they needed to control the narrative by choosing when and how to reveal it. Laura disagreed. She argued that this was a private family matter that didn't need to be shared with the world. Their great-great-grandmother had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it secret, and they should honor that choice. Why should they subject themselves to media scrutiny and public judgment for something that happened over a century ago? Charles, who had been quietly observing the conversation, finally spoke. He explained the constitutional considerations, the fact that as queen consort, Camilla's ancestry would inevitably become a matter of public interest if it ever came to light. The palace needed to be prepared with a response even if they hoped to never use it. Silence wasn't necessarily the safest option. Tom and Laura stayed for dinner and the conversation shifted to other topics, but the revelation hung over everything. Camilla could see them both processing the information, adjusting their mental pictures of their family history. Later, as they were leaving, Laura hugged her mother tightly and whispered that nothing changed how much she loved her. Tom, less demonstrative, simply squeezed her hand and promised they would get through this together. After they left, Camilla felt emotionally exhausted. Telling her children had been one of the hardest things she had ever done. But there was still another conversation looming, one that Charles had been carefully considering. Should they tell William and Harry? Or were Tom and Laura's connections to this story different enough to justify keeping it within Camilla's immediate family? Charles believed transparency was necessary. William, especially, as heir to the throne, needed to know about any potential issues that could affect the monarchy. Harry, despite his complicated relationship with the family, also deserved to be informed. Secrets had a way of causing more damage when they finally emerged than if they had been shared honestly from the start. The following week, they invited William and Catherine to Windsor Castle for a private dinner. Harry was contacted separately through secure channels. Charles had decided to tell his sons individually, recognizing that their relationships with Camilla were different and required different approaches. William's reaction was measured and thoughtful. After hearing the story, his first concern was for Camilla herself, asking how she was coping with the revelation. He had grown to genuinely care for his stepmother over the years, appreciating her steadying influence on his father. The DNA discovery didn't change his opinion of her, though he acknowledged it would create challenges if it became public. Catherine, always diplomatic, focused on the historical aspect. She found Lady Margaret's story fascinating, even admirable in its way. A woman in a difficult situation had found a creative solution that allowed her to maintain her marriage and social position. It was a very human story, she observed, the kind that people might actually find sympathetic rather than scandalous. William agreed to help coordinate with the palace's communication team on potential response strategies. He suggested that if the story ever did go public, framing it correctly would be essential. This wasn't a scandal in the traditional sense. It was a glimpse into the complex realities of upper-class life in the Edwardian era, a time when social pressures often led to creative solutions to very real problems. Harry's response, when Charles finally reached him by phone, was more emotional. He had his own complicated feelings about royal identity and authenticity, having publicly struggled with his role in the family. He listened to the story and then surprised everyone by laughing. Not cruelly, but with genuine amusement. He told his father that this proved what he had been saying for years, that the monarchy's obsession with bloodlines and heritage was outdated and ultimately meaningless. While his response wasn't what they had expected, Charles found himself agreeing with parts of it. The revelation had forced him to think about what really mattered in defining identity and worth. Blood was just biology. Character, choices, and commitment were what truly shaped a person and a family. Over the next few days, Camilla noticed something shifting inside herself. The initial panic and identity crisis were giving way to something else. Acceptance, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. She was learning to hold two truths simultaneously. She was who she had always been, and she was also the product of a more complex history than she had known. She found herself thinking often about Antoni Kowalski. The great-grandfather she had never known existed. What music had he played? What dreams had he pursued in Paris? Had he ever thought about the child he had helped create? She would never have answers to these questions, but somehow just asking them felt important. He was part of her story now, woven into the fabric of her identity whether she had known it before or not. Dr. Warren continued her research, uncovering more details about the Kowalski family and the Vienna connection. Each new piece of information felt like recovering a lost part of herself. Camilla asked for copies of everything, wanting to create a complete record for her own understanding and for future generations who might one day want to know the truth. 6 weeks after the DNA revelation, Camilla stood in the palace archives, surrounded by newly organized materials about her true ancestry. Dr. Warren had completed her investigation, and what had started as a shocking discovery had become a rich, complex family history. The boxes contained letters, photographs, newspaper clippings about Antoni Kowalski's musical performances, and even a recording of him playing Chopin on a piano in Paris in 1925. Listening to that recording had been an emotional experience. The music was beautiful, showing real talent and sensitivity. This man, her great-grandfather, had been more than just a historical footnote. He had been a real person with gifts and dreams, someone who had briefly intersected with Lady Margaret's life and unknowingly changed the course of an entire family line. The advisory team had presented their final recommendations to Camilla and Charles the previous day. After weeks of analysis, they had concluded that proactive disclosure was not necessary. The secret had been kept successfully for over a century, and there was no immediate threat of exposure. The distant relative who had suggested the DNA test had been contacted through intermediaries and had agreed to confidentiality in exchange for being told the full story. However, they also prepared a comprehensive response plan in case the information ever did become public. Press releases had been drafted, historical context documents prepared, and talking points created for every possible angle the media might pursue. If the story broke, they would be ready to respond within hours, framing it as a fascinating piece of family history rather than a scandal. Rebecca Chen had even conducted focus groups to test different narratives, though carefully worded to avoid revealing the actual situation. The results had been encouraging. Most people found historical family secrets interesting rather than shocking, especially when they involved the challenges of earlier eras. The key, Rebecca explained, was to present it as a very human story about difficult choices made in a different time. But the decision of whether to eventually go public voluntarily was still unsettled. Charles believed in transparency and worried that keeping the secret was a form of deception. Camilla, however, felt that some things could remain private. This was her family history, not a matter of constitutional importance. She had earned the right to decide what to share with the world. They compromised. The full story would be documented and sealed in the royal archives, accessible to future historians but protected by privacy restrictions for 50 years. If the information became public during their lifetimes, they would respond honestly and completely, but they would not volunteer it unless circumstances made it necessary. Lady Margaret's letter would guide them, her words about character and conduct being more important than bloodlines. Tom and Laura had both come to terms with the revelation in their own ways. Tom had commissioned his own genealogical research, tracing Antoni Kowalski's line and even locating photographs of some of their Polish relatives. He found it fascinating, this unexpected branch of their family tree. Laura had been slower to accept it, but eventually she told her mother that knowing the truth had freed her from some of the pressure she had always felt to live up to aristocratic expectations. She was who she was, regardless of bloodlines. The most surprising response had come from Camilla's grandchildren. When Tom and Laura eventually told them an age-appropriate version of the story, the younger generation had been thrilled. They thought it was exciting to have a great-great-great-grandfather who had been a musician in Paris. One of Laura's daughters, who was studying music herself, said it explained where she got her talent from. The innocence of their acceptance reminded Camilla that identity crisis was partly a product of the expectations and pressures adults created for themselves. As spring turned to summer, Camilla found herself viewing her role differently. The revelation had forced her to think deeply about what made her qualified to be queen consort. It wasn't her bloodline, she realized. It was her decades of experience, her understanding of British society, her ability to connect with people from all backgrounds, and her commitment to service. These qualities came from who she was, not from whose genes she carried. She also felt a strange sense of liberation. For so long, she had carried the weight of representing aristocratic tradition, living up to the expectations that came with her family name. Now she understood that family names were just labels, stories we told ourselves about who we were supposed to be. The truth was always more complicated and interesting than the official version. One afternoon, Camilla returned to the palace chapel where she had cried so bitterly weeks before. This time she felt calm. She thought about all the women in her family line. Lady Margaret, making an impossible choice to secure her future. Lady Rosemary, living her life never knowing the full truth of her origins, her own mother, passing on stories and traditions without knowing their complicated reality. And herself, discovering the truth and learning to integrate it into her understanding of who she was. Each of these women had done what they needed to do in their own time and circumstances. Lady Margaret's deception wasn't a sin, it was survival in a rigid social system. Lady Rosemary's ignorance wasn't a failure, it was a form of protection. And her own decision to keep the matter private wasn't cowardice, it was respect for her family's right to privacy. Charles found her there, sitting quietly in contemplation. He sat beside her and they held hands in comfortable silence. Finally, Camilla spoke. She told him that she had decided something. She wanted to visit Paris someday, to walk the streets where Antoni Kowalski had lived and worked. She wanted to see if she could find the concert halls where he had performed, the cafes where he might have spent his afternoons. It wouldn't change anything, but it would help her feel connected to this part of her heritage that she had never known existed. Charles thought this was a wonderful idea. They could make it a private trip, just the two of them, visiting as tourists rather than as king and queen. They could trace Antoni's footsteps without ceremony or press coverage, just two people getting to know a piece of their family history. The following month, they did exactly that. They spent 3 days in Paris, guided by Dr. Warren's research. They found the building where Antoni had lived, now converted to modern apartments. They visited the Salle Pleyel concert hall, where he had performed on several occasions. They even tracked down descendants of Antoni's French family, though they maintained the cover story of being interested historians rather than revealing their true connection. Meeting those distant cousins, seeing their faces that carried echoes of features Camilla saw in her own mirror, was profound. They were ordinary people with ordinary lives, completely unaware that their grandfather's brief arrangement in 1909 had connected them to British royalty. Camilla and Charles had lunch with them, discussing Antoni's life and musical career, and came away with new photographs and stories to add to their growing collection. On their last evening in Paris, they sat at a sidewalk cafe watching the city's evening bustle. Camilla reflected on how far she had come in 2 months, from the shock and tears of that first morning to this peaceful acceptance. The DNA revelation had been devastating at first, but it had also been a gift. It had forced her to examine her assumptions about identity, heritage, and what really mattered in life. Charles asked her if she regretted taking the DNA test. Camilla considered the question carefully. The truth had caused pain and uncertainty, but it had also revealed a fascinating story that would have remained hidden forever otherwise. Lady Margaret's courage and Tony's talent, the complex web of choices that had led to her own existence. These were valuable to know. Even if they complicated her understanding of herself, she told Charles that she didn't regret it. The truth was always better than comfortable ignorance, even when it was difficult to accept. And perhaps that was the real lesson of this entire experience. Life was messy and complicated, family histories were never as simple as they appeared, and identity was something you created through your choices and actions, not something you inherited. When they returned to London, Camilla resumed her royal duties with renewed purpose. At a charity event for genealogical research, she gave a speech about the importance of understanding family history, how it connected people to the past, and helped them understand themselves. She spoke generally, but anyone who knew her secret would have heard the personal conviction in her words. The media noticed something different about the Queen Consort that summer. She seemed more relaxed, more comfortable in her role. Royal commentators attributed it to her growing into the position, becoming more confident in her duties. They had no idea that she had gone through a profound personal transformation, that she had questioned everything she thought she knew about herself, and emerged stronger for it. In the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, Camilla sometimes wondered what Lady Margaret would think if she could see her now. Would she approve of the Queen Consort her great-great-granddaughter had become? Would she be proud that her carefully kept secret had been discovered but handled with discretion? Or would she be horrified that the truth had come out at all? Camilla liked to think that Lady Margaret would understand. They were both women who had navigated impossible situations, who had made difficult choices to protect the people they loved. Across the span of more than a century, they shared a common experience. They had both learned that sometimes the greatest strength was in holding secrets, and sometimes it was in finally letting them go. The DNA report remained locked in Camilla's private safe, along with Lady Margaret's letter and the key documents from Dr. Warren's investigation. Someday, perhaps when she and Charles were gone, a future generation would discover these papers and decide what to do with the truth they contained. But for now, it was enough to know, to understand, and to carry forward with grace and dignity. Camilla had learned that identity wasn't something you inherited or discovered in a DNA test. It was something you built every day through your actions, your choices, and your commitment to the people and causes you cared about. She was queen consort not because of her bloodline, but because of who she had become, and that she realized was far more meaningful than any family tree could ever be.